Hello, everyone. We're just starting the webinar now. My name is James Avanatakis. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission here in Canberra. So I want to begin by welcoming you all. First and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge that I am actually on the land of the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra and acknowledge their elders past, present, and of course, future. I also acknowledge that we are placed in many guests across this continent and all the various nations that you're on today. Thank you for joining us for Fulbright Day to celebrate the sort of part of the global celebrations of the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program. Today, we've invited 4 fantastic Fulbrighters to discuss some of the crucial issues that we're going to be facing over the next 75 years based on the lessons of the last 75 years. But unlike the future, we're not looking at the future through a rearview mirror. We're actually looking forward through a number of different perspectives. What happened in the past doesn't necessarily shape what's going to happen in the future. Now, our program began a few years after the global program was created. Today is the 22nd of October, is exactly 72 years since the Australian and the US governments finalised negotiations over the terms of the Fulbright Treaty. We actually predate the ANZUS Treaty. Now, just for interest, and something that probably hasn't changed, was a description of the Australian delegation that negotiated the treaty was, and I quote from the US negotiators, Australians were seen to be capricious, uncooperative, and obstructionist in their negotiations. And as I said, little appears to have changed in those last 72 years. Since then, we've actually seen 5,605 scholars, students, and researchers travel between our two nations. And we've seen the strengthening of this unbreakable alliance through many treaties, including the ANZUS Treaty, Five Eyes, and now the AUKUS Pact. The future may be uncertain, but the relationship between our two nations isn't. We've not always agreed, but we agree on the pursuit of freedom and dignity. We have not always got it right, but we agree that we can do it better. Now, before I introduce the panelists and the speakers, some housekeeping. We'll be taking Q&A after the initial discussion, so please have some questions ready. And you can send them to Sarah through the Q&A function. Also, please be aware that we are recording this panel for those who couldn't make it. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the panel. And rather than reading their extraordinary bios in detail, and each one of them does have an extraordinary bio, I'll simply highlight probably one of their most impressive achievements, that is their Fulbright Award. So I'll begin with Professor Peter Shergold, Chancellor at Western Sydney University and Fulbright Scholar at Pennsylvania State University in 1984. Helen Zhang is a manager of Google Search, Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google Incorporated. She's the author and co-founder of Intrigue Media and Fulbright Ann Wexler Scholar at Harvard Kennedy School in 2019. Adam Davids, Board of Directors at Social Ventures Australia, is a Fulbright Professional Scholar in Non-Profit Leadership and was at Inroads in 2019. Misha Zielinski, Australian Workers Union, Assistant National Secretary, Fulbright Professional Scholar in Australian-US Alliance Studies, and is the Alliance for Security and Democracy Scholar 2021. And of course, our wonderful MC, Sarah James, who's an award-winning journalist, author, and a Fulbright board member. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks so much, James. And I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm going to go back in reverse order now as we begin the questions. And I wanted to mention to everyone, we have so many topics that we want to discuss. So we're going to bounce around quickly at the beginning, and then we're going to dive in deeply to some of these issues that are facing Fulbright and facing the world. Misha, I'm going to start with you because I know that you've got to leave our panel discussion a little bit early. And I want to talk about some of the traditional roles of Fulbright, how the mission saw itself, and then how we need to think about these as we look forward for the next 75 years. So beginning with you, Misha, Fulbright said this should be something that turns swords into plowshares. Well, the world has only gotten hotter, and I'm not just talking about climate change. Can you tell us about when you landed in Washington, D.C. to begin your Fulbright Scholarship and how powerful and important that has been?
Yeah, so thank you for that, Sarah. So when I arrived, I actually was on a very, very long flight. Flying from Australia to the East Coast takes a long time anyway, but it was like a 30-hour flight. I had to go to Doha to DC, so I was going like the wrong way because of all the issues relating to lockdown, et cetera. So when I arrived, despite being severely jet lagged, the United States had Joe Biden just announced the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so basically, what we had in that moment, by the time when I landed, 20 years of foreign policy assumptions that, you know, they've essentially been in place since 9/11 kind of evaporated. And by the time from when I landed, and I'm still jet lagged on Sunday, but between that time of the announcement of the withdrawal, you then had the Taliban sitting inside, the presidential headquarters. So within 3 days, 20 years of effort to build the nation state of Afghanistan collapsed. And so it was precipitous. So on my first day at CSBA, undertaking my Fulbright, the domination of discussion of Afghanistan about, firstly, should the withdrawal happen? And then secondly, the nature of the withdrawal was enormous. And so, that was my, when I landed. And since then, we've had AUKUS, we've had the Quad Leaders meeting, we've had the 70th anniversary of ANZUS, and I've only been here 2 months. So who knows what happens before the end of the year.
Right. So it's supercharged, it's crystallized in that kind of fulcrum, I guess. But I guess as a follow on from that, how important is it, do you believe, to physically be there while this is playing out, Misha?
Well, it's the immersiveness, right? So, you can read about things. The benefit of Fulbright is that it's a knowledge exchange, but it's a cultural exchange as well. So, the conversations that I've been privy to, the things I'm learning at lunchtime just with my colleagues are something that I'd have to go seek out, over a period of months at home, just because, firstly, it's not my area of expertise sort of, in the day to day, but secondly, you just, being embedded somewhere is just enormous. So being able to sort of take in the noise and intensity of US politics and debate, on a political context, in the kind of think tank land, in the general sort of media information discourse, being here, you can look at it from afar, but really being on the ground really does give you a really true sense of the speed and intensity of the United States discourse.
All right, let me move now, if I can, to you, Adam. When we talk about that sense of place and the importance of actually being there, again, this is a kind of a core premise of Fulbright, disrupted by COVID. You managed to get back to Australia at the end of 2019. How important was it for you, Adam, to physically be in the United States for your Fulbright scholarship?
I felt blessed. Arriving back right as the pandemic was kicking off and unfolded, I felt truly blessed to have done my Fulbright right before that period of time. For me, my reflection is on Aboriginal culture and history tells us that places matter, and that we have traditionally songlines are stories and laws and traditions that are safely secured in communities in different locations. And spending time in the US was such an insight, because it's like no one group or people has all the answers to global issues, but I think we each hold different pieces of the puzzle that, when put together, the right narrative and problems can be assessed and solutions generated. And I think that certainly my reflection, coming from an Aboriginal cultural standpoint, that has always been the case. And so I would say, thinking forward for Fulbright and any educational exchange, to just truly appreciate the fact of being in a place and a location, and the insights that you can draw that you might not otherwise get if you were from a distance. The only final thing that I would say on that note is that, like, in Aboriginal culture, astronomy was such a massive thing that, depending on where you were, your global positioning and what you're observing, it changes the perspective. Spending time with people in the US, on the ground, even looking at the stars with them, I was trying to find the Southern Cross, and not knowing that things are going to look a little different, and the stories therefore that follow are entirely different when you're there in person.
So it's funny when you say that. It reminds me of when we moved here to Australia, and our daughter was in primary school, and they asked her if she'd seen the Southern Cross in New York, and she wanted to fit in and said yes, and they all started laughing. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Those human moments, they're fantastic. Moving on, though, in terms of actually what you saw under those stars, under those different stars, you also were there at a pivotal time in terms of watching the world change, watching a kind of if you will, a heat in other ways. I'm thinking in particular of issues like Black Lives Matter. What was the significance for you as an Aboriginal Australian of seeing things that you would have read about, being part of it, watching it up close?
My experience was so varied. Anything from having experiences with quite overtly racist people in a bar that I had to leave simply because of a discourse, to having just phenomenal conversations under the stars where, I sat with, by coincidence, stayed at an Airbnb, and I wanted to stay with people. I was driving from St. Louis to Cincinnati and staying with some people that I came to learn were quite avid Trump supporters, but sitting with them in the backyard by the fire, talking and, gaining a certain understanding, for me was just such a precious opportunity to build appreciation for, I think, the commonalities. Like there are so many commonalities between the different perspectives and different political affiliations in the US that I saw. And there is a common, I think, at least from my experience, a common goal for kind of peace and prosperity. But I think where there's a discourse is the kind of the facts that detail the difference and the disproportionate rate of poverty, and also the method and solutions to get to things like equality and equity. A lot of my work has, an engagement with things like Black Lives Matter from a professional and a personal standpoint. And so looking at, various sides of the coin, so to speak, I think was a precious opportunity.
Yeah, I want to come back and unpack some of that a little bit more. But when you mentioned facts and you mentioned that aspect of it, it absolutely is a situation in which we've faced a double pandemic, haven't we? I mean, there's been the COVID pandemic and there's a pandemic of disinformation. Helen, that brings me to you. You've got a foreign affairs background. You're with Google, you're in media. From that standpoint of disinformation, can Fulbright, do you believe, help be a kind of a vaccine against disinformation? And if so, how do we make it more effective, a stronger vaccine with booster shots as we go forward? How do we make that broader? That's a big question for you, Helen. But I think disinformation is a crucial topic, and can Fulbright be part of it?
Firstly, I have to commend you on working through the medical puns. That was very impressive, Sarah, and probably off the cuff. So I think, look, firstly, touching on both what, Misha and Adam have already said, I think Fulbright is so important because the immersive experience means that Australians going to the US get to experience more than just the bi-coastal cities and sort of the supposed elites of the country. And so I think by having sort of one way that Fulbright can sort of, I guess, counter misinformation or disinformation, probably more misinformation, because it's, I think, often misunderstandings of what the US is and the landscapes that's there and how diverse a country is and how multi-layered and complex it is compared to Australia. So one way that Fulbright can do that is sort of encouraging students in the future to go to more second-tier cities or sort of cities that are out of the usual well-trodden, beaten path, and experience these experiences that Adam has just alluded to, and sort of speaking to people and connecting humanity. So whether that's through sort of field trips, whether that's through programs that are run in those cities, I think that's one way that definitely Fulbright can help towards that conversation. But I mean, unpacking the broader issue of misinformation and disinformation in the tech space is something that I think, Fulbright can probably coordinate and do some exchanges or sort of professional exchanges with not the maybe big tech, but also I think within industry groups to better lobby the big tech companies to have, transparency and algorithms and sort of educate the public on what misinformation, disinformation is and where that conversation is heading. So I think there's a lot of, roles for Fulbright to play in the different areas of academia and professional scholarship exchanges and sort of cultural exchanges. Does that sort of touch on your?
No, those are
question,
two.
Sarah?
You've raised two really important and quite different issues. So I want to come back to disinformation in a minute and bring that out for the entire panel. But just going to that other point that you mentioned at the beginning, Helen, the need to think beyond the coasts of the United States. I mean, I think that's something that's so important. The US is a diverse country, as is Australia. There's an old expression, think globally, act locally. Should we also act laterally? And by that, I don't just mean geographically. I mean, thinking of moving out with Fulbright. In other words, getting out into regions, into areas, more broadly engaging when our scholars are in place in a country, making sure they see more of the country in all kinds of ways. Is that important, do you believe?
I think absolutely, especially in the context of Australia, where I think a lot of our media for better or worse, tend to simplify what's going on in the US. And so either we're sort of polarized in the views of saying CNN as America or Fox News as America, but we're missing that sort of nuance with the different states, the 50 states of the US and how different they all are and their different priorities. So I think having that sort of intersectional sort of like understanding of what the US is and how complex it is with 330 million people, the diversity in geographies and diversity in sort of, socioeconomic positions is really important to understand why policymaking is so hard in Washington, DC. I mean, I did my studies in Boston on the East Coast, and comparing that experience to my brief stint in Denver, Colorado, to where I am now in San Francisco, it's like completely different countries, right? America is really like a continent. And I think having that sort of West Coast, East Coast divide means that both sides, big tech doesn't really speak to DC, and then DC doesn't really understand what's going on in Silicon Valley. So that's just one segment of how diverse the US is. So I think if Fulbright were able to sort of help students better understand the complexity of the US, I think it would go a long way in furthering bilateral relations.
Helen, that's incredibly helpful. Let's move now, if we can, to you, Peter, because you understand this program both as having been a scholar yourself, and you're there now at a university, both as a professor, as a chancellor. So you get the big picture in terms of seeing scholars leave campuses here and go over to the United States or come here to Australia to study. Let me ask you first, as a scholar, giving us a little bit of a sense of history here, since your scholarship was back in the 80s. We look at the kinds of issues that Misha was talking about at the beginning of this conversation in terms of things that the US is facing, and that initial mission of Fulbright, swords into plowshares. And wow, it's a much hotter world than it was when you were a scholar. What's the significance of that for Fulbright? How do we need to engage with that?
Look, for me, when I went to university, I wanted to see the world. That's what I went for. And this is pretty way out for 1965. I went to Hull University, a north of England trawler town, because I could there study American politics, American history, American literature. And that was to open up the world. I went and did my master's at the University of Illinois, and I carried with me, without knowing it at the time, I think the spirit of Fulbright. I wanted to live there. And I arrived in time for the 68 Democratic Convention. So on one hand, I was with the yippies in Lincoln Park. I also went to a George Wallace rally at the Stockyards. And I was doing it intentionally because for a person of my age, when I went to university, I wanted to hear views from all angles. Now, I got to say, the one thing that scares the willies out of me at the moment, and I was listening to Helen with great intent, is sometimes what we're doing with social media, because social media is allowing us to curate a world where we never hear from people outside our bubble. We curate it, so we're always hearing similar voices. What going to the United States in 1968 meant, what going as a Fulbright actually to Pittsburgh in the 70s, and then at the Penn State in the 80s, for me, was that opportunity to, not live in a safe space, but in James's word, in a brave space, to go and have all sorts of experiences. And I couldn't agree with what Adam was saying more, that opportunity to immerse yourself from every angle. And you have a freedom, I have to say, as an outsider going into a country, you had a freedom that often people within the country don't have, because you can say, I am going to use this opportunity to explore, not just go and see great tourist sites, and that's all important, but to get different perceptions from different angles. So on my Fulbright, of course, I enjoyed the teaching at university. And of course, I enjoyed the research in archives. Of course, I enjoyed the seminars, etc. But I enjoyed just talking to people and doing things. One of the things I was able to do at Penn State was to volunteer to teach on a course for American unionists on American labor history. I mean, what an incredible experience. And not for me, but for them. For them suddenly to find this weird outsider coming in with this funny accent, who actually knew more about American labor history than they did. It was great. And that creates that conversation and that experience. I've got to say, I think Fulbright is more important than when I was able to use it in the 70s and 80s.
Well, and following on from that, when you talk about James's point that universities should be not just safe spaces, they should be brave spaces. Does Fulbright need to be braver? Does Fulbright need to be bolder? And if so, what does that look like, Peter?
It does, but I think it's done a great job. You know, when I was in CEO of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, because I'd been a Fulbright, I went to Fulbright and said, look, this is extraordinary. We need to have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people getting access. Fulbright were amazingly responsive. I have to say, in my view, it's a much more democratic and democratically based scholarship than most, much more democratic in my view than something like Rhodes or even Monash. I think it has been very responsive to changing, so that instead of, having to go as an academic for a year to a major American institution, when I look at the range of things that people are using Fulbrights for now, I think it's much more open and much more exciting. And yes, that is the way I think that Fulbright needs to go. But it's always got to have, I think, two things at its base. One, we've talked about that ability to immerse yourself in culture beyond the specific research or teaching that you're doing. And the second is to understand how much more than when I first went as a Fulbright, this is central to the challenges we're facing on democratic governance. I've got to say, by the time I'd finished my second Fulbright, it looked like we were right. History was ending, that, liberal democracies were winning the world. All hail Fulbright, we had succeeded. 30 years on, you think that's not the case now. Democracy and its values are under attack from within and without. And Fulbright, I think, is at the key of being able to combat that.
All right, let me move from you, if I can, to you, Adam. And I saw a lot of panelists nodding as we talked about, the fact that democracy is under siege, that there is a crisis around the world. I think we can agree on that. But Adam, I want to go back to something else. We were talking about, does Fulbright need to be braver? Does it need to be bolder? And if so, what might that look like? I was interested in my conversation with you a few days ago about what you saw as potential mistakes that we might avoid here in Australia, lessons we could learn, things that you saw that excited and challenged you, and also potentially mistakes that we might avoid by being more inclusive, learning more from one another. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and just to piggyback on something that Peter said just now, was that the appetite in the US for global exchange is just extraordinary. There's such a license of access to people that even people within the country might not have access to. I was having this exchange with the Obama Foundation, and some of the staff were telling me about this gentleman named John Rogers Jr. As one of the most influential African Americans, who started the first Black-owned investment management firm, is on the board of Nike, the New York Times, and McDonald's. And I think they were in disbelief when John actually accepted a meeting with me and an exchange. And to the point of the things that we can avoid, I think it was through exchanges with people like John Rogers that exposed me to issues such as racial wealth inequality, which is kind of a use of terms that I haven't really heard in Australia all that much. And so it really struck me. And pulling the lid off on that subject, which I decided to dive into a whole lot more, what I found was that the wealth inequality between Black and white Americans actually hasn't really changed since 1970. The rate of home ownership, as one indicator, is actually less than it was today than it was in 1970. And it just really strikes me as an item, because it kind of then starts to help to unravel certain things as to, well, why has that not changed, and what is it about that particular subject in Australia that we might build conscious of and awareness of, and therefore what solutions can we borrow that's being proposed in the US. And funnily enough, that was partly subject to my whole Fulbright exchange. And so to kind of long story short, there are really 5 dimensions of things that I think Australia can be aware of that the US has shown us in spades. NASDAQ has just is now regulating racial diversity on corporate boards. It's now mandated for gender and racial diversity on boards. You know, in Australia, we've just appointed the first Aboriginal director of an ASX company. So the representation of Aboriginal people in leadership, we know has been an issue, but it's particularly an issue in corporate Australia. That is something that I think for decades since the civil rights has been fought for. And I think that fight in Australia really is just kicking off. So it's one that I think we could leverage. And, you know, this global, you know, movement to, you know, eradicate to build anti-racism within workplaces. When you look at companies like Nike and the position that they take on racial issues, it's much more deliberate, it's much more overt, but you also have to acknowledge that there are 2 black board directors on the Nike board. And these things just didn't happen by accident. They happened because the power structure has actually shifted, I think, in a positive direction, that there is much more awareness nowadays and much more support and investment into key equity measures.
Can I move to you now, Helen, in terms of, you know, Peter and Adam are both talking about that kind of hearing different voices, understanding parts of the conversation that you get when you're in a country. And I think we have to come back to that question of how we hear things when we do, in a tech world, live in these bubbles. And not to make this all for you to have to answer as the tech person. That's unfair and reductionist. And we in media have a huge role. Individuals have a huge role. But I'm just struck by your insight as somebody who understands it from that place. What do you think we can do as Fulbright to extend that? And just what you observe in terms of that kind of partisanship. You know, it strikes me that there are going to be people who would really learn from this conversation who won't hear it because it's not part of their bubble, just to give one tiny example. Adam spoke earlier about, you know, his conversations with families where you break it down over looking at the stars. How do we get people to look at the same stars or appreciate the other stars when we're all living in bubbles?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, with the easy question, Sarah.
I know, I'm giving you the tough ones.
You know, yeah, I think, you know, these echo chambers, epistemic bubbles, they've always been around, but of course they've been elevated by tech platforms. And I think specifically, you know, social media platforms, and, you know, without naming names, I mean, obviously there's the big F, and they've, I think, been really raked. Facebook, sorry, really been like raked over the coals recently in regards to sort of algorithmic transparency and the way that they deliberately sort of feed information. I think that in regards to your question, what can Fulbright do? I mean, I proposed perhaps like having more scholars sort of directly, or sort of career tech policy people be embedded in sort of industry groups that are in that space to better understand the conversations that need to be had with Congress to regulate tech. But really, I think this broader trend is sort of, it's happening everywhere. And I don't know what specifically society can do, because, you know, in addition to sort of the world becoming more segregated by choice, by algorithmic choices, we're seeing a decline in sort of common shared spaces. Like, for example, if you're taking public transport, if you're going to the movies, or you're going somewhere outside of your immediate sort of social bubble and your community. So I think that's a really dangerous aspect of sort of the, I guess, balkanization of society that we're seeing more and more. I don't know, these are the real big questions that we all have to grapple with. And I think that one way that tech companies, I mean, specifically speaking for search, Google search, is that, you know, we are very cognizant of being transparent about where news sources come from, and being sort of deliberate to point out if there's sponsor content or the sort of background of the content, so that there's more information for people to sort of, when they're interacting with information that they see online. But in terms of these sort of epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, it's a really tough issue that, you know, even the top scholars at Harvard Kennedy School are still debating. So
that's incredibly useful though, but those are some very specific reference points. And I know, Adam, you've got a story that kind of is illuminating here. I want to go to that, and then Misha, I'm going to come to you. But Adam, let me give you an opportunity to share a story that relates.
Yeah, I really resonate with what you say, Helen, around the bubbles. Like, the US has such a such an insightful and, I mean, terrible experience of segregation that is still alive in so many forms. And there's a gentleman that I came across. I didn't get to meet him, but you can watch him online. Daryl Davis is a jazz musician who his kind of mission from the age of 10 after experiencing racism was, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And it became his life mission outside of being a musician to trying to answer that question. And he's now infamously known for having taken hundreds of people and that have denounced the KKK. So people that were members of the Ku Klux Klan have since left the Ku Klux Klan, including the Grand Dragon, because of his personal experience with them. And I think that, like, you know, in the kind of what are some of the solutions? Building trust and mutual understanding and respect was critical to his methodology, as in sitting down with them, actually having a common bond over music, which for those members of the KKK had belief was that rock music, as an example, were created by white people. But through his experience and knowing the Black musicians that were integral and pioneers for rock music, it really shocked them. And so a process started to unravel where, wow, okay, we now have a common relationship on a subject that we both care deeply about. And they've since, you know, understood for themselves that they had been brainwashed, in their words, and have since left. He's now the godfather to many of their children, you know, as a show of evidence of how that's changed. But I agree with that point of getting out of that bubble and building a genuine relationship as being critical.
You know, I'm sorry, I just have to follow on from one thing that I really wanted to ask you about before, Adam, related to this. You know, there's that wonderful story of somebody who's able to reach out and change people's minds. But it, you know, it's quite devastating to me as an American that you went into a bar and experienced racism yourself. I didn't want you to gloss over that. I wanted to know what happened and how you dealt with it, and how we help and protect scholars if they have similar experiences. What do we do?
Yeah. So I was with a group of white people at a bar, and this gentleman was quite clearly, you know, it was an older gentleman who was kind of coming over, paying particular attention to this young girl that was with our group, and you know, I could tell he really wasn't a fan of me being there. He would never really address me, so I could see just in the dialogue there was a moral disconnect. I could sense, and so after a period of time, and the group were really not fans of him constantly coming over, and so, you know, I made a comment to say, hey, we're actually really content here, and, you know, thanks for the gestures and what have you. And boy, he did not like a Black person talking to him or stepping out, I think, in that manner. And so he went on to, you know, say things like, I grew up poorer than any Black person, and you must be an Obama lover, and you know, all these things. And we were actually there to watch a boxing match between a white Aussie guy and an African American. And so I kindly said to the gentleman, you know, we came here to watch the boxing match. I happen to be cheering for the white guy. I hope you have a good night. I certainly plan to. And so he continued to rabble for a little while and then walked back over to his buddies. But what the group that I was with didn't quite understand was that, you know, that is now a dangerous situation. So, you know, looking at him and his friends, you know, looking over, you know, I didn't feel safe. So I said, you know, we're going to have to, as soon as this is done, we're going to need to move. And they didn't really understand the history of oppression and experience of Black people in the United States. And this was in the South. So we really had to move on. And I would just say that to scholars that travel in the US, and in particular the South, you know, if you do sense that there is something up, then, you know, you don't wait around to try to find out. Oftentimes, if you're feeling like something's uncomfortable, then it's okay to just move on.
And I think that we need to, you know, make sure that those stories get back to us at Fulbright, because we need to, you know, to be there for you to the extent possible after the fact, and make sure that those things get addressed. I'm really sorry that you had that experience, and I do appreciate that you talking it through with us. Misha, I know you're going to have to leave in a couple of minutes. When I think about partisanship and bubbles, really, truly, where on earth could that apply perhaps more than Washington, D.C.? So before we leave this discussion of partisanship, you know, there were times in the US when, despite public posturing, there were a lot of conversations back of house where the deals got done, where people, you got to be in the room where it happens and you got to do some trading. So what are you seeing, if anything, because it doesn't seem like that's happening from afar? And what do we, I guess, what do we do, Fulbright, the world more broadly, to address that? I don't think that's a Fulbright alone lift, but I'd like to know how you think Fulbright could operate in a space of such intense partisanship.
I mean, it's a really hard problem to solve, right? I mean, a lot of the things we've talked about have already covered off some of the reasons. I mean, the question is politics a lead or a lag indicator of society, right? So do we get the politics that we deserve? So in some senses, we've become more divided in societies, and the politics are following those incentives, right? But I mean, I don't think we should let politics off the hook or politicians off the hook. Clearly, I'm not someone that thinks, there go the people, I must follow them if I'm their leader, right? We need to, expect leadership from our politicians. But you're right. I mean, the days where, deals could be done are much, much more difficult, because now the imposition of cost on those deals, on those politicians, is quite severe. So it's seen now, used to be virtuous if you could, negotiate. Now it's seen as weakness, dealing with the enemy. I mean, this sort of language that has made its way into our politics. And I say the royal we of politics, American politics is the most partisan, but most politics around the world tends to take its lead from the United States, regrettably. So, that sort of language, and it used to be the sense that you and I could have a policy disagreement and we would disagree, but we could maybe have a drink afterwards. But now it's become, not only am I right, you're evil. And so that distinction, and to describing political opponents not as opponents, but as the enemy, I mean, it's very difficult to build any sort of discourse around that. Now, of course, Joe Biden ran on a sort of message that he could get things done. He ran on a notion that he could be more bipartisan, given his experience in the Senate. Regrettably, there was a deal done on the infrastructure bill where there were 19 Republicans that did vote in support of that. It's now caught alongside a different bill where Democrats are trying to attach a larger spending bill to that, and it's grinding back into the partisan mess. So it's a real shame that bill couldn't get out of both houses of Congress, because I think that would have been a significant achievement for the United States. Because ultimately, when you look at democracy and you look at cynicism and you look at all the things we've talked about, I mean, people feel cynical about politics because elections happen, but there's no change. Nothing comes of it. And so, democracy is a results-based business. And so you need to see results. It's not theory. And so, it is super regrettable that you didn't see, look, we elected a new president. He was able to reach out to Republicans. Now I've got $1 trillion of expenditure going to crumbling infrastructure. And, if you've been around the United States, and I haven't just been in the US, I've been getting around, the state of the infrastructure here is not great. So that $1 trillion would be very useful, not just on a macroeconomic basis, but in communities. So super regrettable about that. How you unstitch it, I don't know. I do think you've got to find ways to reach out. Everyone sort of blames the other, but the lack of ability to reach out is extraordinarily toxifying to democracy. And just as last point I'd make is one of the most regrettable trends in US politics, and it comes down, I think, to the nature of non-compulsory voting and the way you sort of have to turn out your base, is that persuasion has just completely been abandoned. So you no longer even message to persuadable voters. It's about literally turning out voters that already agree with you. And so that, again, has a sort of toxifying effect on politics. Because if you've given up on even bothering to even understand what a person's concerns are and say, okay, why don't you like this idea? Let me explain why it's a good one. No, forget about it. I'm just going to go find two people that do to offset your issue with it. I mean, it's not a good place to be. And it leads politics to not be about negotiation and getting together and getting things done. It becomes about conquest. And when politics becomes conquest, it becomes enormously divisive and enormously toxic on society.
Those are really, really good points. I wanted to ask you before we let you go, because I know we're getting to that time.
I can stick around a bit longer. I've pushed back some people. So
because this is a fun conversation and you don't want to leave, and we don't want
more fun than the next meeting. I'll tell you that much.
Of course it is. So here's a question for you following on from that, Misha. Who's getting it right? I mean, you're there in Washington. There's a lot that's not working, but I mean, really, truly, we want to emulate the play. The expression on your face says you're not seeing that. Is that the case? Is that what I'm reading from facial expressions?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'd love to give you a positive story because, I mean, I am a great believer in the United States and its role that it plays as a sort of the democratic standard bearer. You know, I always talk about the United States as the captain of team democracy. It's the quarterback. And so, in this struggle with autocracies, and, picking on Peter's point at this end of history period, kind of history's back, right? And we can prevail. I mean, I actually think the autocrats, they talk a big game, but they're much weaker than they project. But it's really contingent on democracies sorting out their own, issues, right? And they need to deliver for people. Coming back to the point about delivery, I mean, when we won the Cold War, West Berlin was manifestly a better place to live. It wasn't just, people read Marx and read, Jefferson, and when Jefferson's got the better argument, it's better living in free, open, economically profitable societies. And a lot of the time now, you got people working very hard and going backwards. You got all these problems. And you say, well, why would I be in a democracy? Why should we? So if it's not delivering, if we can't solve that. And so to answer your question, I really look around and scratch my head. If you look at Donald Trump and his performance over 4 years was deeply troubling. But without Joe Biden, there's a good chance that the Democrats would have lost that election. So they're running on an agenda that is not really being received in large parts of the country, and they don't want to acknowledge that. They don't want to reach out and say, hey, what's going on? How do we bring you along with our agenda? Because they've got good policies, arguably, but they're not being supported. So what's the disconnect? And so when you consider that problem exists, and you think about, you look at the difference between Joe Biden's vote and the way that the Democrats performed in the House and the Senate, without Biden, they lose that election. And Biden's 77. And so who are the Democrats coming through? I can't see them. And on the Republican side, regrettably, a lot of the good people are leaving that party, and it's being colonized by those that are, have views that I think are antithetical, forgetting about democracy, certainly antithetical to what Fulbright stands for.
So let's go to you, Peter, from that point, because I think, again, what Misha's talking about, and I want to open this up, by the way, all panelists. I mean, this is an all panel discussion at this stage, very definitely. So, send me a chat, wave your hand. I'm going to take you on board. But let me start with you, Peter, if I can. Because again, if we go back with that little historical lens to, where this all started, when Fulbright started, I mean, it looked like it was kind of game, set, match democracy. To Misha's point, wow, you would vote with your feet, right? You left because it was just demonstrably better to live in a democracy. Now other arguments are being made economically, and yet there's the specter of the loss of democracy, or even geographical spaces. I mean, look at the South China Sea. It's an alarming spot right now. So, where do we, what happens there? How do we make the case for democracy if, as Misha just said, it's a results-based game, and right now the scoreboard is looking a little low for democracy on certain points? What do we do?
I think this is the challenge we're all facing. I have to say that, to be honest with you, I feel more pessimistic about the future now than probably I did 20 years ago, because it did look game, set, and match. And I agree, the United States has always played that fundamental role in my lifetime as the quarterback of democracy. The challenge we've got now is at the time when we've got, autocratic, authoritarian challenges around the world. I have to say, one's never seen a democracy weaker, starting in the United States, but I think weak in Australia, weak in the United Kingdom. This is really challenging. So at universities, and I think this has got to be fundamental ethos of Fulbright, we've now got to train people not just for intrinsic merit or get them to see education as a sort of instrumentalist purpose for the labour market. That's important. We got to say we're really wanting, through Fulbright, to teach about active citizenship, active engagement, what it means to be a citizen. When we talk about the extraordinary growth in inequality and income and wealth in the last 30 years in the United States, what we're really talking about is the hollowing out of that great American middle class, who without thinking would give to philanthropy and volunteer. There was that middle class energy. It was never a problem. When I was on a Fulbright, there were always things you could be invited to because of that. Now, as the middle class, I think, is being hollowed out, that too is disappearing. So it isn't just, if you like, the high level politics. It's the degree of civic engagement which underlies democratic values. And that's why I think what Fulbright is saying is that it is about a whole experience. It is not just about book learning, which we can do online. And again, I think this goes beyond democracy. The other thing that I see as a real challenge, and I'm trying to address in a number of government reports, is what I think is happening with the distortion of education. And this will be odd for a Fulbright to say, but where I think there is a privileging of skills of the head above skills of the heart and skills of the hand. Now, unless we can understand that learning comes from the whole experience, then we're missing something. When I think back, and I didn't make this connection before this panel discussion, why am I pushing for schools to move away from ATAR and just external exams and make sure every student has something that I've been calling a learning profile? It goes back to Fulbright, because what I want is to say to young people 15 and 16, isn't this great? You're learning this from maths and English and history, but you're learning from captaining the netball team. You're learning from volunteering for Greenpeace. You're learning by doing Saturday night shifts at McDonald's. All of that is learning if we understand it as such. And I think at the very heart of Fulbright, in a sense, is that ability to learn from the whole experience of visiting a culture. And I go back to what I would say, and I think a number of us said, it is two ways. So yes, isn't it wonderful? We have all learned, but all of us know from our experiences, there have been moments on our Fulbright where people listening to us have had their world open because of the different perspective we bring.
Well, no question about that. And getting into that sense of it, I mean, you had the opportunity for a Fulbright. Everybody is here because they either have or are on a Fulbright, have had or are on a Fulbright. So, I mean, Helen, I want to go to you quickly because I want to move quickly for these last minutes. You know, that business that you talked about earlier about going to the Midwest, having that opportunity to get beyond, you know, Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C., New York City. I really want to get to the value of that, how crucial you think that is. And I think you didn't feel like you got quite enough of that opportunity on your Fulbright. So let me know if that's the case. And the second question is, do we need to extend who's getting these Fulbrights? Do we need to rethink who is a scholar? And if so, how? So first, the traveling to the Midwest Sarah, or wherever, and secondly, extend.
Yeah, just before that, I do want to touch quickly on what Misha and Professor Peter Shergold had just said about the US. I do think that, you know, overall democracy is in good shape. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because Fulbright isn't just with Australia, it's with the rest of the world. And I think what Fulbright's doing in developing economies is actually really great. And if you look at sort of the way that democracies around the world have rallied in the Trump years, I think overall we're in really good shape, particularly with like Glasgow coming up and how many countries have really committed to net zero. So I think it's an important antidote to keep in mind that we're in good shape. The US has its own systemic issues, but actually the world is in, you know, yes, a different sort of place, but multipolar doesn't necessarily mean that it's a more dangerous place. So that's one thought. And then, so I think on the Midwest, I do think that, you know, we had one cultural trip and one sort of like, I guess, sort of orientation trip in the US, but I do think that there should be more opportunities, for example, volunteering opportunities or sort of like weekend travel opportunities that Fulbright can help facilitate. And I know that they have a lot of things on their plate, so it's probably, you know, something that tends to get dropped, but I do think that those priorities should be raised. And I think students can really gain a lot out of that, speaking to what Professor Shergold had just said. And then finally, the second question, what was the second question, Sarah? Sorry.
Oh, you know what? Actually, it was about, should we have more scholars? And I wanted to go to Adam on that too. Should we broaden, should we broaden the scholar piece? Let me move, if I can, to you. I'm conscious of time.
Sure.
Adam, just following up on that, do we need to do a better job of including more people in the Fulbright Scholarship Program? Do we need to, you know, do we need to think about what the metrics are for a scholar in the same way, Peter, that you were just mentioning, the way you look at what you count when somebody comes into university, the netball, the job. Do we need to think about some of that in Fulbright, Adam? What do you think? Yeah,
it's exciting to hear your thought process on that, Peter. You know, I think about the young kids in Aboriginal communities who are getting so much experience putting together the church groups and the community groups and managing elders and, all these types of experiences that are an incredible skill set that's been developed that can be used and recognized in certain ways. So that's really exciting. I'm a non-profit scholar, and I feel blessed for that reason. I don't believe that there have been many. It's been running for several years, but it is truly visionary. And the social sector in Australia is growing, and through Social Ventures Australia, that's one of the things that we're trying to continue building. And, with the thriving social sector and non-profit sector is going to create an incredible pipeline of talented people to take full advantage of scholarships like this one. So I would certainly love to see more non-profit scholars. And from the US, I'd love to bring over some scholars from particularly minority backgrounds, historically Black colleges and universities. And I know we have hosted Native American students in the past, but there is a richness in understanding and experience that that certainly I think we should be looking at. Who else can we invite over to a higher degree of frequency?
Yeah, so I think that's important. And I just want to raise one thing. By the way, everyone who's watching right now, feel free to send us questions. I'm seeing a couple of comments. First comment is that everybody's doing a fabulous job and people are enjoying it. One comment that's just come through is that they think the question isn't so much tertiary education, but secondary education. I'm interested if anybody wants to weigh in on that. Does anybody weigh in on that? And then I have a question for you, David, after that. Do we think the question is tertiary or secondary education? Peter?
Let me just come in very briefly, because I was focusing on secondary education, because I believe that is where the problem starts, that at ages 14 or 15, we're getting students to believe that they have to choose between whether they want higher education and therefore do the 8R subjects or do vocational education. It's a complete nonsense in terms of the tertiary sector. My own view is the problem starts secondary, and we have to reimagine tertiary in a way in which vocational and higher education comes together.
All right, I've got one question for you, but Misha, I've got to go back to you really quickly, because I saw you shaking your head at some things that were being said earlier about the power of democracy. And I'm an MC, I'm never going to ignore that. Colin Powell, who just died, former Secretary of State, said optimism is a force multiplier. But in your view, are we being too optimistic about democracy? It didn't look like you were terribly optimistic.
No, well, I mean, not to sort of challenge what Helen said. I mean, I think we've got to be honest about where we are. Now, I believe democracy can win. It's the better system. It's where people want to live. We don't keep, to paraphrase JFK, we don't keep our people behind a wall. You look at the fact that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, spends more money defending itself from its own people than it does on external military spending. So that gives you a sense where they think they sit in respect to how, their societies. But, saying that democracy is in good shape, I mean, the events of January 6th, the Capitol insurrection in the United States, I think speak for themselves. But we've been in a democratic recession now for years, according to, external monitors like Freedom House. I mean, the European Union, they've got an autocratic member. Hungary is a recognized autocracy. That's in the EU. You look what's happening in Turkey. I mean, the amount of backsliding in pretty well-established democracies around the world has been staggering. And it's happened right here, where I sit, Washington, DC. It's happened in the home of democracy. And so, I don't think we should be pessimistic, but we've got to be realistic about where we sit, because if we don't actually address those challenges and be honest about them and look and go, what is the record of democracy here? And I contrast two presidents that have existed in my lifetime. Bill Clinton, he said, at the end of his presidency, the future was all about liberal democracy and freedom, and that the questions of history had been answered. 20 years later, Joe Biden, someone that served alongside President Clinton, he's now president. He says the principal challenge facing the world is whether democracies can deliver for people. Now, autocracies are walking around saying, no, they can't. They can look at the way they handled COVID. Look at the way we've raised hundreds of million people out of poverty. And so, we really need to get honest about where we sit, because if we're not honest, we can't possibly hope to win. I think we can win if we pull together, focus on our values and focus on delivering for people, but we've got to have an honest starting position.
Helen, anything you want to add to that before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't disagree with that, Misha. I think I'm very clear-eyed about where things start standing with democracies. I think what I meant more broadly is multilateralism, and I don't think multilateralism has been receding. I think, of course, under the Trump years, there's been the absence of the US, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the US is not the only player, and to go back to history and to say that, it's still a sort of Clinton era golden arches theory, sort of Fukuyama end of history, is unrealistic, because it has changed. The world has changed. It's a multipolar world, and China is here to stay. So I think if we're unrealistic about that, then I don't think we can have real solutions. States no longer have the monopoly over power, information, which is why I think tech companies are very, very important players in that space. But I would just say that, I think more broadly, it's probably a question that we should consider as society, like, what is the purpose of democracies? If you can get a vote, but you can't eat and you don't have enough, sort of livelihood to keep you sustained, then what's the point of sort of keeping that structure without delivering on these basic needs that people need? So I think the idea of democracy needs to be re-examined as well. And I think a robust sort of real look at our existing systems, multilateral, domestic, needs to be had. And I think this conversation extends beyond the US.
I think this is a fascinating conversation. Adam, I'm gonna let you jump in.
Yeah, it's really interesting, like, listening to the dialogue in this conversation, but also outside of this conversation. It feels like the sort of democracy is at threat, but I think that people sometimes think that this is a new problem. We've been reminded throughout history that, democracy is an ideal that nations haven't always upheld that ideal. Dr. King reminded us of that in the 1960s. If you look at the propaganda that has been undertaken towards Aboriginal people during the Eddie Mabo developments of Aboriginal people are going to steal your backyards, it hasn't always been fair. So I don't think it's a new problem. And so I think we ought to tell ourselves the truth of how long has democracy been under threat. It's just now that the power structures are on the receiving end of disinformation. And so now it feels like it's a new problem, but I wouldn't entirely put it that way. I do also remain hopeful that this system is an incredible one that can be used for great good, but we just have to hold it to its ideals as best we can.
This is a fascinating conversation, and we're now getting some questions for our panelists. So I'm going to jump in and see anybody raise your hand if you want to answer. This is from David Atkins. How will the Australian Fulbright program look different in 10 to 15 years' time? And what will drive the changes that you anticipate? Anybody want to jump in on that one? Anybody?
I'll jump in and say that I think, by that point in time, we are seeing more and more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students go to university. And there are some incredible scholars already out there. One particular Aboriginal scholar is, a physicist that is working at NASA. And, these are the scholars that we are going to see more and more. And so I think the diversity is going to continue to increase. And that I'm particularly excited about.
I might just come in. I think inevitably Fulbright has got to become increasingly diverse. I think it still lags behind Australian society as a whole. When James and I used to do graduations at Western Sydney University, we'd always have guest speakers. And they would often say, gosh, I didn't realize how many overseas students you had coming here. Of course, we don't. We have 15% of overseas students. What people were actually seeing was the future face of Australia walk across the stage. That's what they were seeing, but they didn't realize that. Now, as I say, what's going to happen in the future, I have no doubt. Both naturally, and I think because of the way Fulbright tends to focus its efforts, is that much greater diversity of the face of Australia going overseas.
Here's a question. We've talked a lot about how valuable it is for people to actually spend that time in another country and look at the stars, breathe the air, have the experiences. Here's a question. Can virtual education bring Fulbright and international education to a much larger number of people, particularly low-income Americans? Any thoughts on that from our panelists? Helen, you're nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely can. And I think what I was going to answer to the previous question is that I think that in 10 to 15 years, we can also see more Americans coming to Australia, because I think often the value of Australia is probably not appreciated enough by Americans, particularly, in the geopolitical sense, in how much sort of knowledge and experience we have vis-a-vis North Asia as well as Southeast Asia. So I think, if we have opportunities, virtual opportunities for low socioeconomic families in the US to sort of experience being in Australia, then that's definitely a wonderful thing. And I think that would increase, I guess, whet their appetite for coming to Australia whenever our borders open up and, get international students in.
Anyone else with any thoughts on the idea of more virtual education or international exchanges? Because, I confess to having mixed feelings myself. On the one hand, it's great to be able to connect people as we are right now from Zoom. But are we also just missing something kind of massive in not being able to immerse? Misha, you're there right now. I'm going to put the question to you. Is this Fulbright Exchange the same if you're not physically in Washington, D.C.? If you have an opportunity to talk to all the players, but you're doing it from Canberra or Melbourne or Sydney?
No, look, I mean, I think the answer is no, right? I mean, you want to extend it to as many people as possible. I would, if we're trying to extend it to the people describing that question, then let's just get those people into Fulbrights and find ways to, get more funding for Fulbrights and find ways to do more cultural exchange, because cultural exchange can't be done from a screen. As much as I'm enjoying you all right now, it'd be much more fun if we're all sitting together and, it's nighttime, my time, so a beer, but, a coffee or what have you in Australian time. But, you can't put a price on that. And I think, frankly, the Fulbright Commission were very reluctant to let me go because they were worried that the United States would still be working from home. And because the principle, I could read these reports about political warfare, et cetera, anywhere in the world, right? And I could, perhaps interview people via screen, but you really need to be in it and of it to truly understand. And as I described, the experiences I've had just at lunchtime, talking about what the Taiwanese are doing in terms of, military acquisitions and why that doesn't make a lot of sense. That's just one example that comes to my head right now. I mean, and there's countless examples of that. So regrettably, I don't think you can do it. So if the aim is to extend Fulbright, let's find a way to extend it, but you got to be realistic about the tools.
It strikes me that Fulbright allows for the intersection of study and serendipity, those serendipitous encounters that you have. Adam, I know one thing that you mentioned in our conversation was literally seeing portraits on the wall in some of these offices that you went to. And you can know that an organization, let's say the NAACP, has been around for a really long time, but to see the portraits, are there moments that strike you that just really brought the value of everything smashing home to you?
Yeah, like I really appreciated the longevity of the social sector that has served the African American and Hispanic community over such a long period of time, sitting in the boardroom of organizations with, 20 presidents from this organization over its history of 100 years is just incredible. I think about, going back to that question that was cast just before around, how do we bring access, international exchange if it was virtual? I do worry that, as the COVID pandemic broke out in the US, and a great example that highlighted the issue was that up to 80% of Black and Hispanic workers were not afforded the chance to do virtual work because they weren't in jobs that you could conduct virtual work. And so I think there are things like this that we have to appreciate. On the point of longevity and what Fulbright can do, I sit on an advisory group with UTS who are building the first ever Indigenous residential college at a university campus that is purely created and for Indigenous students that will have more than 200 beds. And, this is a more than 100-year vision into the future of where do we have to be invested in to increase the pipeline of prospective scholars that, won't have to face the issues of virtual work being a limiting or a barrier, but rather immersing people from disproportionately disadvantaged backgrounds into these arenas. And so I think that there are things like this that perhaps Fulbright could investigate and contribute to that I think are visionary and really long-term. That has been shown in the US.
Thank you very much. Peter, there's a question for you here. As a parent of two school-aged daughters who are incredibly inquisitive, reasonably intelligent, my role as a parent is to support them through secondary education, trying to keep the light of curiosity from fading as the school system in its current format squashes their zest for lifelong learning.
And I just responded to Brent online, so I so much agreed with that. Look, the challenge is, as we know, children grow up naturally inquisitive. And what we too often are doing now is stifling that at secondary school and limiting the sort of ambition that Fulbright has beyond school. I mean, clearly we need a system, an educational system, which can provide the foundational skills. And yes, you know, ability to communicate, do math, digital literacy are more important, not less important, more important than ever. But what we want is a schooling system where people can pursue their interest to a much greater level than they can already. You know, at the moment we train people that most of our children, I suspect, that they've got to get the best score in ATAR. And in fact, we completely distort how they study their final years at school in order to get the best score. We need to say, frankly, we want you to study anything. If your interest is ceramics, go ceramics. If your interest is plumbing, go plumbing. Because beyond it, we haven't got a system anymore. One of the very good things that has changed in my lifetime, you know, when I was a kid at school, you did an external exam at 11 years of old. And that essentially distinguished what your future life was going to be. We don't have that anymore. Yet we teach young people at school that we do, and we behave as if that's the case. So that, I think, is, in a sense, going back from where we are with Fulbright and what we think is its value to this range of learning, that actually is that ethos is what we want in our schools.
You know what, Peter, I'm just going to jump in there. You're making me think that we need to have like a Fulbright, you know, like a Fulbright club for younger students. Like, we need to kind of somehow get that notion that you can be thinking about this, that your world can be big and vast and interesting from a really young age. I mean, you know, it really, it's an interesting idea.
Why did I go and get interested in American history and politics and literature? Because after I discovered Bob Dylan as a poet, I discovered a guy called E.E. Cummings. And essentially, I went to a university to study E.E. Cummings. Now, of course, I didn't. I was a part of it. But it was that passion that got me engaged.
Right. I've got one question. I'm looking at the time and we're going to wrap it up here. But we have another question for the panel from Hal. Most of the people I interviewed that are repeating and consuming disinformation are doing so over social media. What role can traditional media play in helping to disarm this? Does anybody want to jump in on that question? And then we'll allow for one more and then we'll wrap it up. Anybody? Yes,
I might go. Look, I mean, I think media just needs to focus as best it can on doing its job, right? So when, you know, there's been some outstanding journalism done in Australia over the last few years in respect to uncovering a lot of, you know, the infiltration of the Chinese Communist Party into Australia's democracy. That was done by journalists, and that was truth-seeking, and it was outstanding. And really, when you look around the world, when I'm here speaking to people, they discuss just how important that was. So I think the role of media and the role of trusted media is actually going to be more important. With disinformation, I think what will happen over time is that information will start to get discounted and there'll be a flight to quality, hopefully. So if you see quality journalism, and we need to find ways to make sure that's rewarded by the tech companies, not sort of, I guess, sucking up all the advertising money, but if we can make sure that quality journalism is rewarded and valued, then I think a flight to quality will inevitably occur. So, you know, yes, we need to make sure the social media companies are prioritizing good information and discounting bad information. We need to make sure the incentives there are not towards outrage, but towards insight. But, you know, I think if you're a journalist, and it sounds like you are, quality journalism, believe in the mission, it's so important. And it does do the job still, I think.
All right. Well, I think we're hitting our time. And, you know, as a journalist, if you don't hit your time, that's a problem too. So I'm going to pause here and thank our panelists, Adam Davids, Professor Peter Shergold, Helen Zhang, and Misha Zielinski. Fascinating. Talk about insights. That's what's been provided over the last hour and 15 minutes. James, I thank you for letting me be the MC. And Larry Lopez, our chair of the Fulbright Commission here in Australia, I want to send it over to you, my friend, as we wrap it up here.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much for doing such a great job as MC. And also, I want to thank all the panelists, Professor Shergold, Helen, Adam, and Misha. And Misha, particularly, here we go. Sorry, I had my video was off. Not by my own choice, by the way. Here I am in person. So when we're talking about this bicoastal diversity, the first thing I'm going to ask as the chair is that we don't do 6 a.m. meetings, because it pretty much, even for an early riser like me, it makes it hard here in WA. And I think people do forget how a simple thing like that does contribute to this issue of focuses on particular coasts. And that's from a boy from San Francisco who spent my whole life complaining about the US media was focused on the East Coast. But again, thank you to these wonderful panelists. Thank you to all the participants who took time today. I was really surprised by how many people were on the call, not that I should have been. I also just want to very briefly, even an event like a virtual event like this is not easy to put on. So thank you to the Fulbright team for producing this event this morning. I thought this was a great event because it really, in some ways, covered two different areas. One, we talked about some great issues facing Australia and the United States and the world, but also some really important issues for Fulbright to address, particularly around diversity. And it is something that's very high on our agenda. And these things are always difficult to achieve, but it is really important to us. I will say that one of the first diversity challenges that Fulbright faced was around gender, which we've accomplished. So I'm hoping that trend will allow us to have greater diversity on other across the board. But I finally just, and I don't want to take a lot of time, but like Fulbright, for us to grow, we're very dependent on outside funding. We don't generate any revenue ourselves. And so I just want to thank the United States government and the Australian government for their ongoing support, along with all the different universities and institutions in Australia and family offices that support us. So that's all I really have, but I really just want to say a huge thank you to everyone involved today. I thought this was a great way for me to start my day, although the sun wasn't even peeking over the hills here. But thank you very, very much for making the time for us today and for sharing such great insights. And I think is that it? Alex or James, do you have anything to, yeah.
Thanks everyone.
Everybody.
I think you're the voice.
I'm the
of
last
farewell.
one. Great. Well, thank you very, very much. And
it was fantastic, everyone. I just thank you so much from me. I mean, wow, there were so many, we could have spun off on each and every one of those conversations, but we really covered a lot of ground, and you're very generous with one another and really quite powerful and thoughtful speakers. So thank you.